The cuckoo clock on the cafe wall in Lanzerath showed 5 minutes to midnight. First Lieutenant Lyle Book sat against the cold stone wall, his leg bleeding through makeshift bandages, his field jacket soaked with the blood of his 19-year-old runner who lay beside him, face so disfigured that consciousness came and went in waves of agony. Outside, through the cafe windows, German paratroopers moved through the small Belgian village, their shadows long in the firelight from burning American vehicles. Book watched the clock's hands creep toward December 17th, 1944. In 5 minutes, he would turn 21 years old. The war, for him, was over. His men were captured, 14 of them wounded. His mission, he believed, was a catastrophic failure. What Book didn't know what he couldn't know, as he sat in that cafe awaiting an uncertain fate, was that his 18-man platoon had just accomplished something extraordinary. They had held off 500 German elite troops for nearly 20 hours, delaying the spearhead of the entire German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. They had inflicted 92 casualties on an enemy force that outnumbered them nearly 30-1. And in doing so, they had bought time, precious, irreplaceable time for the Allied forces to respond to Hitler's last great gamble in the West. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 6 days earlier, on December 10th, Book and his intelligence and reconnaissance platoon had taken up position on a wooded ridge overlooking Lanzerath, a village of 23 homes, and a church that sat astride a critical road junction near the Belgian-German border. The assignment was supposed to be temporary, a couple of days at most. The 2nd Infantry Division was being pulled out and replaced with the inexperienced 106th Infantry Division. Until the 106th could occupy their positions, the right flank of the regiment, the division, and the entire corps was exposed. Major Robert Kriz had driven Book out to the woods on the outskirts of Lanzerath and showed him where he wanted the platoon set up. He told Book to fortify their position with logs, even though Kriz didn't expect any action there. This was the Ardennes forest, after all the ghost front, where nothing ever happened. The terrain was too difficult, the roads too poor, the weather too miserable for any serious German offensive. That's what Allied intelligence believed. They were catastrophically wrong. Book's platoon consisted of 18 men organized into 2 9-man reconnaissance squads, all attached to the 394th Infantry Regiment of the 99th Infantry Division. These weren't ordinary infantrymen. They had been hand-selected because they were expert marksmen and in peak physical condition. Many were college-educated, former members of the Army Specialized Training Program that had been abruptly terminated when the Army needed more combat troops. Their mission was reconnaissance, establishing listening posts, conducting patrols behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence. They weren't trained for sustained combat. They were supposed to avoid direct engagement with the enemy. But Book took his responsibilities seriously. He acquired extra automatic weapons, improving their firepower beyond the standard allotment. His men dug deeper, reinforcing their foxholes with logs, creating well-camouflaged positions along the edge of the woods, overlooking the fields that sloped down toward Lanzerath. From their positions, they could observe the village and the road that led east toward Germany, west toward the vital crossroads at Losheimer Graben. Unknown to Book, that road was the designated route for Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite armoured formation that would lead the 6th Panzer Army's drive toward the River Meuse and ultimately to Antwerp. The men of Book's platoon lived in primitive conditions during those early December days. They slept in foxholes covered with logs and branches. The cold was relentless, dropping well below freezing at night. They had field jackets, overcoats, and combat boots, but the damp cold of the Ardennes penetrated everything. They supplemented their sea rations with potatoes scrounged from a basement in nearby Hunningen, where they had been billeted before moving to their current positions. At 20 years old, Buch was one of the youngest commissioned officers in the entire United States Army, and he was the second youngest man in his unit. He had enlisted in the Missouri National Guard at 14 during the Great Depression, desperate to earn money for his struggling family. By 16, he was a supply sergeant. When officer candidate school became available, he volunteered and graduated fourth in his class of 57 officers in August 1942. He was so promising that the Army kept him at Fort Benning, Georgia, for a year to teach small unit defensive tactics to other officers. Now, 2 years later, he found himself responsible for 18 lives on a frozen hillside in Belgium, 6 miles behind what everyone believed was a quiet sector of the front. The men of the 99th Infantry Division had arrived in Europe in early November 1944, landing at Le Havre and moving quickly to the Ardennes. They were inexperienced, none had seen combat before their arrival. The division had relieved the battle-hardened 9th Infantry Division, and the veterans had assured them that this was a rest sector, a place where green troops could get acclimated to the front lines without facing serious action. The Germans, everyone said, were finished. The war would be over by Christmas. Paris furloughs were being planned. The reality of December 16th would shatter those comfortable illusions with the force of 1,600 German artillery pieces firing simultaneously across an 80-mile front. On the German side of the lines, in the forests around Blankenheim, Germany, an entirely different reality was taking shape. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division German paratroopers were preparing for Operation Autumn Fog, Hitler's desperate counteroffensive. But these were not the elite paratroopers who had jumped onto Crete in 1941 or seized Fort Eben-Emael in 1940. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division had been virtually destroyed during the Normandy invasion, ground to pieces in the Falaise pocket. It had been resurrected using replacements from the 22nd, 51st, and 53rd Luftwaffe field regiments. The German units were organized around small cadres of seasoned veterans, but most of the men had never fired their weapons in combat. They carried the new Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle, the world's first practical assault rifle, and were equipped with rifle grenades. The weapons were excellent. The soldiers carrying them were not yet soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were teenagers and young men with minimal training, led by officers who knew their mission was nearly impossible. What these young German replacements lacked in experience, their officers tried to compensate for with ideology and propaganda. The recruits were told repeatedly that the American soldiers they would face were soft, undisciplined, and would not stand and fight. Their officers described the Americans as a gum-chewing, undisciplined half-breed with no stomach for real war. The Germans had been told that American units would crumble at the first serious attack, that American soldiers cared more about their comfort than their duty, that they lacked the martial spirit of German soldiers. This propaganda served a purpose. It was meant to bolster the confidence of inexperienced troops who would soon be asked to attack positions they couldn't fully see, held by an enemy they didn't truly understand. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, part of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, numbered approximately 500 men organized into battalion strength. They had been ordered to lead the attack through Lanzerath and clear the village before advancing toward Honsfeld and then Bullingen. The mission was time-critical. The entire German offensive depended on speed. The armored spearheads had to reach the Meuse River bridges before American reinforcements could be brought to bear. Every hour mattered. Every delay could prove fatal to the German plan. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the German artillery barrage began. 1,600 artillery pieces opened fire across the 80-mile front. The bombardment was relentless but imprecise. Much of it landed short, wide, or long of American positions. The Americans in Buch's platoon huddled in their log-reinforced foxholes as tree bursts showered them with splinters and frozen dirt. The well-protected positions prevented casualties, but the psychological impact was significant. This was no local counterattack. This was something much larger. The telephone lines connecting Buch's position to regimental headquarters were cut by the barrage. Fortunately, they had one SCR-300 radio, and they managed to report to regiment that something major was happening. The artillery continued for 90 minutes. When it finally lifted at 7 o'clock, an eerie silence descended on the forest. Then, in the growing light of dawn, Buch spotted movement. Through the mist and the lingering smoke from the artillery barrage, he could see a long column advancing from the east. Approximately 500 men in field grey uniforms moving toward Lanzerath in a disciplined formation. Buch immediately radioed regimental headquarters, requesting permission to withdraw and begin a delaying action. The answer came back: "Hold your position." The men of the I&R platoon watched as the German column reached Lanzerath. 3 Americans manning an observation post in a house on the eastern side of the village, James, Slape, and Krieger, were spotted and had to fall back to the main positions on the ridge. Shortly after, the tank destroyer battalion that had been providing armoured support withdrew without informing Buch's platoon. They were now completely alone, 18 men and 4 artillery observers facing a German battalion. What happened next would define not just the lives of these 22 Americans, but would ripple through the entire Battle of the Bulge in ways that wouldn't be understood for decades. The Germans entered Lanzerath cautiously. They had taken casualties from American forces to the north and east, and they were wary. As the lead elements of the German column moved through the village, a young Belgian girl emerged from one of the houses. She spoke to the German officers, gesturing. The Americans, watching from their concealed positions on the ridge, believed she was pointing out their location. They held their fire, waiting. The girl pointed again, and an officer yelled a command. The German paratroopers jumped for the ditches on either side of the road. Buch's men opened fire. The effect was devastating. The Americans had carefully positioned their automatic weapons to create interlocking fields of fire across the open slope. The Germans, caught in the open, began taking casualties immediately. Several fell in the first volley. The survivors scrambled for cover, but there was precious little to be found on the snow-covered slope. Within minutes, the first German attack had been repulsed. The Germans pulled back into Lanzerath to regroup. Years later, researchers would find the Belgian girl, now an elderly woman still living in Lanzerath. She hadn't been pointing out the American positions. She had been indicating the direction the American tank destroyers had departed, trying to tell the Germans that the Americans had left. The misunderstanding had cost German lives and would prove pivotal to everything that followed. The second German attack came mid-morning. This time, approximately 2 platoons from the 2nd Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, attacked directly up the hill, bunched together in the open, charging straight toward the platoon's hidden positions. It was a textbook example of how not to conduct an assault, but these were inexperienced troops led by officers who may have believed their own propaganda about American weakness. Buch's men held their fire until the Germans were fully committed to the assault, then opened up with everything they had. The 30 caliber machine guns cut through the advancing Germans. Riflemen picked off individual targets. The carnage was immediate and terrible. German soldiers fell across the snow-covered slope. The survivors tried to press the attack, but the volume of American fire was overwhelming. Bodies piled up. The wounded screamed for help. After what must have seemed like an eternity to the attackers, the German officers called off the assault. The survivors crawled back down the hill, dragging their wounded when they could, leaving their dead where they fell. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, Buch's men fired, reloaded, and fired again. The artillery observers called in fire missions when they could make radio contact, bringing American artillery down on German assembly areas. But ammunition was becoming a concern. Each man had started with a basic load, and they were going through it at an alarming rate. Buch tried repeatedly to contact regimental headquarters for resupply and reinforcements. A German sniper shot the SCR-300 radio as Buch held it to his ear. the bullet passing close enough that he felt the shock. The sniper then hit the SCR-284 radio mounted in the jeep behind their positions, eliminating any possibility of calling for help. They were on their own. The Germans attempted a third attack in the early afternoon, with similar results. The Americans were burning through their ammunition, but they were still able to maintain devastating fire. The German propaganda about American weakness was being disproven with every attack. These Americans weren't running. They weren't surrendering. They were fighting with a ferocity and skill that the young German replacements had not anticipated. As the afternoon wore on, the situation for both sides became increasingly desperate. Buch's men were exhausted, having had virtually no sleep the night before, and now fighting for their lives for more than 10 hours. Their ammunition was running critically low. Some of the automatic weapons were literally burning up from sustained firing. 14 of the 18 men in the platoon had been wounded, though most continued fighting. On the German side, the casualties were mounting, and time was slipping away. The entire 6th Panzer Army's timetable was being disrupted by these 18 Americans. Behind the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Kampfgruppe Paper sat in a massive traffic jam, unable to advance. The road from Scheid to Loschheim was blocked, partly due to blown railroad overpasses, but primarily because the Americans at Lanzerath refused to be dislodged. Joachim Peiper, the commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, was growing increasingly furious with each passing hour. His lead units didn't reach Loschheim until 7:30 that evening, nearly 14 hours behind schedule. En route, his unit lost 5 tanks and 5 other armoured vehicles to American mines and anti-tank weapons. The delay at Lanzerath was cascading through the entire German offensive. As dusk approached, Sergeant Vince Kulbach of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment pleaded with his officers to allow his men to flank the Americans through the woods rather than continue the suicidal frontal assaults. Finally, permission was granted. 50 men from Fusilier Regiment 27 of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division were dispatched to attack the Americans' southern flank through the woods. Buch, recognizing that his position was about to be overrun and that his men were down to their last few rounds of ammunition, was preparing to blow his whistle to signal a withdrawal when German soldiers penetrated their lines and began overrunning their foxholes. The Americans fought hand-to-hand in some positions. Several German attackers were killed by grenades that had been rigged to wires and triggered by Americans in their foxholes. But the outcome was inevitable. By dusk, the American position was overrun. The Germans pulled the Americans bodily from their foxholes. Buch was shot in the leg during the final moments of the fight. His runner, William James, was catastrophically wounded, his face torn apart by German fire. The Americans were herded together in the gathering darkness. One artillery observer, Billy Queen, lay dead on the hillside. 14 of Buch's 18 men were wounded, many seriously. The Germans began searching the American positions, shocked by what they found. Only 18 foxholes, 22 men in total. That was it. That was the force that had held up an entire battalion for nearly 12 hours, inflicting 92 casualties, 16 killed, 63 wounded, 13 missing. The German officers couldn't believe it. Where were the rest of the Americans? Where were the tanks? Their intelligence had reported that the woods were packed with American troops and armor. The Germans made a critical decision. Rather than press forward immediately, they bedded down for the night, convinced that the woods ahead were filled with more Americans and that advancing in darkness would be suicidal. This decision added crucial hours to the delay. Kampfgruppe Peiper didn't reach Lanzerath until near midnight. The captured Americans were brought to Café Scholzen in the village. Buch sat with his back against the wall, his leg bleeding, watching the cuckoo clock approach midnight. His birthday. William James lay beside him, barely conscious, his terrible wounds beyond anything the limited German medical support could address. The café filled with German officers as more units arrived. At midnight, Buch watched a senior SS officer, whom he would later identify as Joachim Peiper himself, attempt to obtain accurate information about American strength in the area. Peiper questioned Obersturmbannführer von Hoffmann, the commanding officer of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, who reported that his men had run into stiff resistance. The woods and road ahead, he said, were packed with American troops and tanks. He had bedded his troops down for the night and planned to probe the forest for Americans at first light. Peiper pressed for more and specific information, questioning the battalion commander and a captain about the American resistance. Their answers were consistent: strong resistance, heavy American presence, conditions not suitable for a night advance. The irony was profound. The expectations of further resistance were entirely based on the defense offered by Buch's force of just 18 men. The Germans had made a fundamental attribution error. Unable to believe that such a small force could inflict such damage, they assumed they faced a much larger American presence. This assumption added hours to the delay, and those hours would prove decisive in the broader battle. The journey into captivity began almost immediately. The Germans forced the wounded Americans to walk through the freezing December night. William James, his face destroyed by German fire, could barely stand. Robert Lambert and another man, both seriously wounded, were loaded onto trucks. The walking wounded, and that was most of them, stumbled. Through the darkness, their German captors nervous and trigger-happy, the sound of American artillery growing more distant with each agonizing step. After 2 days of walking through the cold, the prisoners reached the village of Junkerath. There, 72 men, Buch's platoon, mixed with other captured Americans, were jammed into a single railroad cattle car designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses. The conditions were immediately inhumane. No food, no water, no heat. The unmarked train travelled for 11 days through the heart of a collapsing Germany, a prime target for Allied aircraft that had no way of knowing the boxcars contained American prisoners. On December 21st, Allied fighters attacked the train. Machine gun fire ripped through the wooden cars. Several prisoners were killed instantly. Others were wounded, their screams adding to the chaos. The Germans didn't stop. The train continued its journey, the dead left where they fell among the living. Inside Buch's car, men began to die from their wounds, from exposure, from sheer exhaustion and despair. By Christmas Day, the Christmas that was supposed to mark the end of the war, 7 men in Buch's car had died. Their bodies remained in the car with the survivors. The prisoners were allowed off the train only once during the entire 11-day journey. They were given a few slices of bread and some water, nothing more. Men who had been strong, healthy soldiers 2 weeks earlier were reduced to skeletal figures, barely able to stand. The train finally stopped at Stalag 13D in Nuremberg. The survivors were processed and split up. Officers like Buch were eventually sent to Oflag 13B. Enlisted men and non-commissioned officers went to different camps. The German POW camp system in late 1944 was overwhelmed and breaking down. Designed for 300 prisoners, Stalag 13C in Hammelburg soon housed more than 1,500 POWs. The daily ration consisted of thin soup, occasionally a small piece of bread. Disease was rampant. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Men died from their wounds, from disease, from malnutrition. The Americans who had survived the battle at Lanzerath now faced a different kind of warfare. The slow, grinding battle to survive each day in captivity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In early spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed around them, the POW camps became even more dangerous. On March 27th, Buch was at Stalag 13C when Task Force Baum, a raid organized by General George Patton to liberate his son-in-law, who was believed to be held at the camp, attacked the facility. Buch, desperate to escape, pretended to be a field-grade officer and accompanied the task force as it attempted to fight its way back to American lines. The raid was a disaster. Almost the entire task force was captured or killed. Buch was wounded again and returned to captivity. He was transferred to Nuremberg, then to Moosburg, where he spent the final weeks of the war. When American forces finally liberated the camp in late April 1945, 1 week before Germany's surrender, Buch weighed 114 pounds. He had contracted hepatitis. His body was racked with the effects of malnutrition and months of barely surviving. He was 21 years old and looked like an old man. The liberation brought a flood of emotions, relief, joy, but also something darker and more complicated. Buch believed he had failed. In his mind, the mission at Lanzerath had ended in disaster. His men had been wounded, they had been captured. He had lost control of the situation. The fact that they had survived at all seemed like luck rather than achievement. He couldn't know what impact his platoon's stand had made on the broader battle. The American army evacuated him to hospitals in Reims and then Paris. In mid-June, he was flown back to the United States and hospitalized at O'Reilly General Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. The young man who had enlisted in the National Guard at 14, who had taught defensive tactics at Fort Benning, who had led his men through the longest day of their lives, came home broken in body and spirit. While Buch recovered in American hospitals, the full scope of the Battle of the Bulge was becoming clear. The German offensive had failed. The delay at Lanzerath had been one of dozens of small unit actions that disrupted German timetables across the front. But Lanzerath's importance was exceptional. The road through the village was the designated route for Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead of the entire northern thrust. The delay, nearly 20 hours from the opening of the German artillery barrage until Piper's armour finally moved through Lanzerath, had cascading effects throughout the German offensive. Those 20 hours allowed American forces to reinforce critical positions, to move supplies, to establish defensive lines that would ultimately contain the German advance. The 6th Panzer Army never reached the Meuse River. They never threatened Antwerp. The northern shoulder of the German offensive, where Buch's platoon had fought, held firm. Military historians would later identify small unit actions as the decisive factor in the American victory at the Battle of the Bulge. The 99th Infantry Division and the 291st Combat Battalion held most of their ground on the first day against the German 6th Panzer Army, creating what became the northern shoulder of the battle. The holding of Saint-Vith, 4 days beyond the Germans' timetable, by elements of multiple American divisions deprived the Germans of crucial time and resources. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division's defence of the vital crossroads tied down German forces that could have been used elsewhere. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later call the Battle of the Bulge one of the greatest American victories of the war. But the victory came at a horrific cost. Approximately 19,000 American soldiers died. 47,000 were wounded. More than 23,000 were missing or captured. The Battle of the Bulge accounted for approximately 10% of all American combat casualties in World War II. For Buch and his men, scattered across POW camps and hospitals, the war ended not with triumph, but with uncertainty and pain. William James survived his catastrophic facial wounds, but would require multiple surgeries and would be disfigured for life. Other members of the platoon suffered from malnutrition, disease, and the psychological trauma of combat and captivity. When they finally returned home, they wanted nothing more than to forget, to move on with their lives, to leave the war behind. Buch attended a chiropractic school after his health stabilized. The care he received from a chiropractor had helped him recover from the lingering effects of hepatitis and the constant aches that plagued him after the war. He decided to become a chiropractor himself, eventually establishing a practice in Street Louis and being recognized as one of the best practitioners in the city. He married Lucy, a grade school classmate, and raised 3 children. He built a life defined not by war but by healing, by family, by quiet service to his community. For more than 20 years, the story of Lanzerath remained largely unknown. The men of the I and R platoons scattered across the country, rebuilding their lives, carrying their memories in private. The war receded into history, replaced by Korea, by the Cold War, by the complexities of the 1960s and 70s. In 1965, the U.S. Army published The Ardennes, The Battle of the Bulge, a comprehensive history of the battle. The I and R platoon. He was briefly mentioned a footnote in a massive campaign. William James Sakanikas, who had changed his name to William James after the war, read the account and reached out to Buch. The brief mention had awakened something in both men. They had done something significant. Their suffering had not been meaningless. But where was the recognition? Where were the medals? Buch contacted his former division commander, Major General Walter E. Lauer, who nominated Buch for the Silver Star. The medal arrived in June 1966, mailed to Buch's home without ceremony. There was no recognition for the rest of the platoon. This angered Buch deeply. His men had fought beside him. They had suffered beside him. They deserved recognition. For the next 15 years, Buch became an advocate for his platoon. He wrote letters to congressmen, to military officials, to anyone who would listen. He lobbied for a formal review of his platoon's actions. He gathered documentation, tracked down surviving members of the platoon, built a case that could not be ignored. The process was frustratingly slow. The Army's bureaucracy moved at its own pace. There were questions about documentation, about the exact number of German casualties, about whether the action rose to the level requiring the highest awards. But Buch persisted. He had learned patience in the POW camps, had learned that survival sometimes meant outlasting obstacles through sheer determination. Finally, on October 26, 1981, 37 years after the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge, a World War II Valor Awards ceremony was held at Fort Myer, Virginia. 14 of the 18 surviving platoon members attended, along with their families. Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh presided. One by one, the names were called. Every man received the Presidential Unit Citation. 4 men, including Buch, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. 5 men received the Silver Star. 9 men received the Bronze Star with Valor device. The ceremony at Fort Myer was both a celebration and a reckoning. These men, now in their late 50s and early 60s, had waited more than 3 decades for recognition of what they had accomplished in their youth. The delay itself was part of the story, a reflection of how small unit actions in war are often overlooked, how bureaucracy and the passage of time can obscure even the most remarkable achievements. The platoon became officially recognized as the most decorated American unit of its size for a single action in World War II. The recognition mattered not because these men needed validation of their courage, they had lived with the knowledge of what they had done for nearly 4 decades, but because it provided closure, a formal acknowledgement that their sacrifice had meaning, that the frozen hillside in Belgium had not been just another forgotten skirmish in a massive war. The strategic significance of Lanzerath became clearer as more information emerged from German records and post-war interviews. Joachim Paper's after-action reports revealed the extent of the delay and its impact on the entire 6th Panzer Army's operations. The German timetable for the offensive had been based on reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. The delay at Lanzerath on the first day cascaded through every subsequent phase of the operation. By the time Kampfgruppe Piper finally cleared Lanzerath and moved toward Honsfeld, they were already half a day behind schedule. This delay meant they hit American defensive positions that had been reinforced and prepared. It meant fuel supplies that should have been captured were destroyed or moved. It meant American commanders had time to assess the situation and respond with reinforcements. John Eisenhower, son of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, and himself a renowned military historian, wrote that his father had told him the actions of Buch's platoon were among the most important small unit actions of the entire war. This assessment, coming from the man who commanded all Allied forces in Europe, carried profound weight. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, his final attempt to split the Allied forces, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement in the West that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union advancing from the east. The failure of this offensive sealed Germany's fate. The war in Europe would end 5 months later with Germany's unconditional surrender. In that context, every hour of delay on December 16, 1944 mattered. Every German casualty mattered. Every disruption to the German timetable mattered. The human cost of the battle extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Buch and his men carried the psychological weight of their experience for the rest of their lives. Combat trauma, what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, was poorly understood in the 1940s and 50s. Veterans were expected to return home, resume their lives, and not talk about what they had experienced. Many did exactly that, burying their memories, trying to move forward. But the memories didn't disappear. They surfaced in nightmares, in moments of anxiety, in the inability to fully explain to loved ones what they had experienced and how it had changed them. The recognition ceremony in 1981 provided some healing. It allowed the men to come together, to share their stories, to acknowledge collectively what they had endured. It validated their experience in a way that mattered deeply. The irony at the heart of the Lanzerath story is profound and multi-layered. The German propaganda that portrayed Americans as weak and undisciplined was precisely backward. The Americans who held that ridgeline were neither weak nor undisciplined. They were expert marksmen, physically fit, well-trained in small unit tactics, and led by a young officer who understood the importance of preparation and defensive positioning. The German paratroopers, told they were the elite, found themselves repeatedly repulsed by a force they outnumbered nearly 30-1. The fundamental miscalculation led to the Germans' fatal error, assuming they faced a much larger force. Unable to believe that 18 Americans could inflict such damage, German commanders concluded the woods must be filled with American troops and armor. This assumption, born from their own casualties and their underestimation of American capabilities, led them to delay their advance. The delay gave the Americans time to respond to the broader offensive. There is also a deeper irony in how recognition works in military organizations. The most decorated platoon in World War II for a single action received that recognition 37 years after the action. The delay wasn't due to doubt about what the platoon had accomplished. The facts were documented in after-action reports, German records, and the testimony of participants. The delay was bureaucratic, the result of a system that privileges immediate reporting and documentation over later investigation and analysis. Buch's persistence in pursuing recognition for his men reveals something essential about leadership and loyalty. He could have accepted his Silver Star in 1966 and moved on. Instead, he spent 15 years fighting for his men to receive the recognition they deserved. The leadership he demonstrated at Lanzerath, preparing defensive positions, managing limited resources, making difficult decisions under extreme pressure, continued in peacetime as he navigated the bureaucracy to ensure his men weren't forgotten. The physical location of the battle has become a site of memory and pilgrimage. On May 12, 2005, veterans of the 99th Infantry Division and local citizens of Lanzerath, Belgium, dedicated a monument on the grassy hill overlooking the village. The monument consists of a small brass plaque alongside a bench and a United States flag. The inscription reads, "In honor and memory of all soldiers who fought here December 16, 1944, I and our platoon, 394th Regiment, 99th Infantry Division." The simplicity of the memorial reflects the simplicity of the action itself, a small group of men, in one location, for one day, doing their duty against overwhelming odds. The monument has become a pilgrimage site for military historians, veterans, and those interested in the Battle of the Bulge. The foxholes, still visible in the Belgian forest, serve as physical reminders of the defensive positions Buch's men occupied. In 2004, author Alex Kershaw published The Longest Winter, a comprehensive account of the platoon's actions and their subsequent experience as prisoners of war. Kershaw spent years researching the story, interviewing surviving members of the platoon, accessing German and American military records, and reconstructing the battle in detail. Buch cooperated with Kershaw but imposed one condition. I told him that other authors never wrote about the other men in the platoon, just me. I said I wouldn't talk to him unless he promised that he'd also write about the other men. This insistence on collective recognition rather than individual glory was consistent with how Buch had approached the battle itself and its aftermath. The book brought renewed attention to the battle and helped ensure that the story of Lanzerath would not be forgotten as the generation that fought World War II passed into history. Lyle Buch lived until December 2, 2016, passing away at age 92, just 15 days before his 93rd birthday. His life after the war had been exactly what his Aunt Mildred had predicted when she read his palm before he joined the National Guard at 14. "If you live past your 21st birthday, you're going to have a good life," she had told him. Sitting in that cafe in Lanzerath on his 21st birthday, wounded and captured, Buch had no reason to believe the prediction would come true, but it did. He lived a long life, a good life, marked by professional success, a loving family, and the deep satisfaction of having fought for his men's recognition with the same tenacity he had shown in defending that ridgeline in Belgium. His obituaries noted his military service, but focused equally on his career as a chiropractor, his devotion to his wife Lucy and their 3 children, his role in the community. The war was part of his story, but it wasn't the whole story. The broader lesson of Lanzerath extends beyond military tactics and strategic impact. It speaks to the importance of training, preparation, and leadership at the smallest unit level. Buch's decision to acquire extra automatic weapons, his insistence that his men dig deeper and reinforce their positions, his careful positioning of fields of fire. These preparations made the difference between a hopeless last stand and an effective defense that achieved strategic impact. The lesson also extends to understanding adversaries. The German propaganda about American weakness was not just wrong, it was dangerously counterproductive. It gave German troops false confidence, leading them to attack in ways that maximized their casualties. It caused German commanders to misread the situation, attributing their losses to larger American forces rather than to the skill and determination of a small unit. Underestimating your enemy is one of the oldest mistakes in warfare, and the Germans paid for it on that frozen hillside in Belgium. For the men of the I&R platoon who survived, the recognition ceremony in 1981 provided something they had needed for decades: acknowledgement that their suffering had meaning, that their actions had mattered in the larger course of the war. Some had struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why they had lived when others had died, questioning whether their survival was justified. The formal recognition didn't erase those feelings, but it provided context and validation. They had done something extraordinary. They had held when others might have run. They had fought with skill and courage against overwhelming odds. The medals and citations were symbols, but the symbols mattered because they represented a nation's recognition of sacrifice and valor. The story of Lanzerath also illuminates the gap between how war is experienced at the individual level and how it is understood at the strategic level. For Buch and his men, December 16th, 1944 was a day of fear, exhaustion, violence, and ultimately captivity. They had no understanding of the broader offensive, no knowledge that they were facing the spearhead of the German 6th Panzer Army, no ability to assess the strategic impact of their defense. They knew only that they had orders to hold, that Germans were attacking, and that they would fight until they could no longer fight. The strategic significance, the 20-hour delay, the disruption of Kampfgruppe Peiper, The contribution to holding the northern shoulder only became clear later, when historians and military analysts could examine the full picture. This gap between experience and understanding is common in war. The individual soldier sees only their immediate situation. The broader meaning emerges later, often much later. The final irony of the Lanzerath story is that Buch spent decades believing he had failed. His men had been wounded, they had been captured. In his mind, these outcomes represented failure, regardless of the tactical success of their defense. This perception reveals something profound about leadership and responsibility. Buch held himself accountable for outcomes beyond his control. The overwhelming enemy force, the lack of reinforcements, the eventual overrunning of their position. It took decades, and the testimony of historians and military analysts, for him to understand that the mission had not been to avoid capture or casualties. The mission had been to delay the German advance, and in that mission they had succeeded spectacularly. The recognition ceremony in 1981 finally allowed Buch to reframe his understanding of December 16, 1944. It wasn't a failure. It was one of the most successful small-unit defensive actions of the entire war. As we approach the 81st anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, fewer than 2% of World War II veterans remain alive. The generation that fought that war is passing into history. The stories remain preserved in books, in documentaries, in monuments like the one overlooking Lanzerath. These stories matter not just as the historical record, but as reminders of what ordinary people can accomplish under extraordinary circumstances. Buch and his men were not professional soldiers. They were young Americans, some barely out of high school, others college students whose education had been interrupted by war. They found themselves on a frozen hillside in Belgium facing an enemy force that outnumbered them 30-1, and they fought for nearly 20 hours with skill, courage, and determination. Their story is exceptional but also representative of thousands of small-unit actions throughout the war where Americans held positions, fought against odds, and made sacrifices that contributed to ultimate victory. The 18 men on Lanzerath Ridge were remarkable individuals, but they were also representative of a generation that answered when called, fought when necessary, and came home to build lives defined not by war, but by family, work, community, and quiet service. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.